Richard Linklater's Before Trilogy is my favorite trilogy of all time and number 4 in my 4 favorites. So of course these movies have had a pretty profound impact on my life, but it's one that's difficult to articulate. Spoiler warning for Before Sunrise, Before Sunset, and Before Midnight. Although I think knowing that it's a trilogy is a spoiler in and of itself, because I saw Before Sunrise after Before Sunset came out, so I already knew there was a sequel. So I didn't have that time to speculate and reflect on the ending of Before Sunrise the way people did when it first came out. I always loved what Richard Linklater said about the ending of Before Sunrise being a litmus test. For context, in case anyone who hasn't seen the movies wants to watch this video anyway, Before Sunrise is about Jesse, an American man played by Ethan Hawke, and Celine, a French woman played by Julie Delpy, who meet on a train headed toward Vienna. They start talking and Jesse asks her to get off the train with him, and then they end up walking around Vienna talking and getting to know each other and spend the whole night together. It's one of those movies that makes some people complain that nothing happens, all they do is talk. But it's the conversations and subtle details that make these films so special, and there's so much nuance to these characters that make them feel like real people. But at the end of Before Sunrise, the characters agree not to exchange phone numbers and instead plan to meet up at the same location in 6 months. And it says a lot about a person if they think they meet up again or not. But of course, if you already know there's a sequel, that kind of ruins the litmus test. But I think the trilogy itself can also act as a litmus test in more ways than one. I think showing someone these movies and seeing how they react to them is a good way to determine whether or not you're compatible with someone you're dating. But that doesn't always work. I can confirm I dated people who loved these movies and it did not work out. However, I don't think I've dated anyone who hates these movies. There was one person I showed these movies to who called Celine a potty mouth, and we never went on another date after that, and it was definitely for the best. But more importantly, I think the trilogy works as a litmus test not based on whether or not you enjoy the films, but based on which aspects of the films resonate with you. I think which movie you relate to most and which character you relate to most says a lot about you. And the beauty of it is that if you're like me, your answer to those questions is constantly evolving, just like how the characters and their relationship are constantly evolving. The first time I saw these movies back when there were only 2 of them, I was much more cynical and cold when it came to the topic of love. I refused to date people because I thought relationships were a good way to get hurt, and I didn't want to give anyone else the power to hurt me. So I related to Jesse in Before Sunrise way more than Celine. When Celine said, "I always feel this pressure of being a strong and independent icon of womanhood, and without making it look like my whole life is revolving around some guy," that line resonated with me because back then I didn't want to give men power over me and wouldn't let myself develop feelings for anyone. I was trying to treat men the way I was used to them treating women. It was pretty much a leave before you get left mentality. But then the next thing Celine says is, "But loving someone and being loved means so much to me." We always make fun of it and stuff, but isn't everything we do in life a way to be loved a little more? And back then I was thinking, absolutely not. I love myself and I don't need anyone else to love me, and I don't care if they do, which is basically the polar opposite of how I feel now. Because now I constantly find myself thinking about how I'm always trying so hard to prove to people that I'm good enough in all areas of life, and it feels like nothing I do is ever good enough for anyone. So now it's not even that I want to be loved. All I really want in life is to feel like I'm good enough. But back then, Celine's romanticism did not resonate with me at all. Meanwhile, Jesse was saying how he sees love as an escape for 2 people who don't know how to be alone. People always talk about how love is this totally unselfish giving thing, but if you think about it, there's nothing more selfish. And that was much more in line with my mindset at the time. And when he says how everyone's parents messed them up, rich kids' parents gave them too much, poor kids not enough, too much attention, not enough attention, they either left them or they stuck around and taught them the wrong things, that's something I still believe to be true. And that's something I was saying long before I saw this movie. And another line from him that resonated with me is when he says, "I think that if I could just accept the fact that my life is supposed to be difficult, that's what to be expected, then I might not get so pissed off about it and I'll just be glad when something nice happens." That's been my outlook for a long time. I just try to expect the worst so that I can be pleasantly surprised when something good actually happens. But over the years I realized maybe I talk like a cynic sometimes, but I'm secretly an optimist. I try so hard to prepare for and expect the worst while deep down everyone's still hoping for the best. There's also the part where he talks about how when couples spend a lot of time together, they start to get sick of each other's mannerisms, which is something I've talked about a lot. I think people need a little bit of space from the people they love so they can appreciate them more and think about all the things they miss when they aren't there, instead of spending too much time together and desperately wanting to get away from each other. But despite his cynicism, Jesse does have a romantic nature about him in the first film. He is the one who asked Celine to get off the train after all. I think the first time I saw Before Sunrise, it was more so the conversations about life that really meant something to me more than their conversations about love. And part of what I loved about these movies so much the first time around was there were so many things I had been saying for years, or things I've thought that I never said out loud before, that these characters were talking about. For example, when they're in the cemetery and Celine points out the grave that belongs to a 13-year-old girl and says it meant something to her because she was that age when she first saw it, and how now she's 10 years older and that little girl is still 13. I always think about that sort of thing when someone older than me passes away and then years later I look back and suddenly I'm older than they were when they died. It's just really sad to see the passage of time like that. Speaking of the passage of time, back when I first saw these movies, I was a lot younger than Jesse and Celine, and the first film was my favorite because despite everything I just said, I could relate to the characters in the first film more. When I first saw Before Sunset, I couldn't relate to either of them. Context again for anyone who's watching who hasn't actually seen the movie. Before Sunset picks up 9 years after the first film. Jesse wrote a novel inspired by his encounter with Celine. He's doing a book signing in Paris and she shows up and they spend the day together walking around and catching up. Jesse is unhappily married and has a kid. And back then I was like, oh, I'm never getting married or having kids. Absolutely not. And Celine seemed so upset about being single. And I was still in my mindset of, I'm happy being single. This is the life I want for myself. I don't want to have feelings for anyone. But eventually that mindset started to shift. And Before Sunset became the more relatable film for me. And it wasn't just because I had gotten older. Even before I reached the same age as the characters in Before Sunset, this one ended up being my favorite. And as of right now, it's still my favorite, but I feel like I've been saying I'm in the Before Sunset phase of my life for a while now. So maybe I'll end up in a Before Midnight phase soon enough. But what's funny is that I originally thought Jesse was more relatable in the first film and could barely relate to Celine at all. But in the next chapter of my life, I turned into Celine in Before Sunset. And I don't rewatch these movies every year or anything, so it took me a while to notice how much I changed over the years. During that time, I eventually started dating, which did not go well at all. And for years, I thought it was fine, I just didn't meet the right person yet. But once I hit a certain age, I started to feel like my options were actually limited. Everyone acts like they have endless options when it comes to dating now because of dating apps. The people who are in unhappy relationships think they can just download Tinder and meet someone new the next day. But if you've ever been single for extensive periods of time, you know that it isn't that easy. There are some people who hop from relationship to relationship, and I genuinely have no idea how they do it. I feel like there are very few people I've truly connected with, which is why I really identified with Celine when she said, I guess when you're young, you just believe there'll be many people with whom you'll connect with. Later in life, you realize it only happens a few times. I think that's the biggest shift from Before Sunrise to Before Sunset for me, learning to value and appreciate those connections and try and hold on to them. But the part that made me realize I turned into Celine was when she says, men go out with me, we break up, and then they get married, and later they call me to thank me for teaching them what love is, that I taught them to care and respect women. Why didn't they ask me to marry them? I would have said no, but at least they could have asked. I cannot even tell you how many people I've gone out with who ended up using things they learned from me to get their next girlfriend. Most of them usually rushed into things with the next person, and I don't know how any of those relationships panned out, and I wouldn't have married any of those people if they asked. But I would at least like some credit for the things I taught them. I would go into specifics, but I don't want to dwell on the past because, as Celine says, memory is a wonderful thing if you don't have to deal with the past. Speaking of which, there are a lot of things Celine says in this one that I found way more relatable. The first time I saw this movie, the ending didn't hit me as hard. I very much hate when people cheat on their significant other, even fictional characters. One time I was reading a memoir, and when the person talked about cheating on their wife, I was like, yeah, I don't want to continue reading this. So the ending of Before Sunset wasn't my favorite at first, but once Before Sunset began to resonate with me more than Before Sunrise, and it became my favorite film in the trilogy, the final scene ended up being one of my favorite endings from any movie ever. I don't think Jesse should have even gotten married in the first place, but obviously Celine didn't show up 6 months after they met like they agreed, and I don't think a person should cling to the past and refuse to move on because they're hoping the person they spent one night with will show up again. His marriage was already falling apart at this juncture anyway, so when Celine is dancing around imitating irritating Nina Simone and tells him he's gonna miss his plane, the look on Ethan Hawke's face in that moment says so much. And it's just this incredibly beautiful moment of, hey, I'm going to throw my entire life away, but it feels like I finally found where I'm meant to be. I still don't condone cheating though, which is why Before Midnight is currently my least favorite of the trilogy, because there are moments that imply that both characters may have cheated at one point. For context, for the people who haven't seen it yet, Before Midnight picks up 9 years after Before Sunset. Jesse and Celine are together, and now they're parents to twin girls. Jesse is trying to be a good father to his teenage son Hank, who he had with his ex-wife, but he lives in Chicago. Jesse's a successful novelist, and Celine is unsure what to do about her career and is considering a career with the French government. Jesse wants to move to Chicago so they can be closer to Hank, but naturally that would hurt Celine's career goals, and they end up having a really big argument. When I say this is my least favorite film of the trilogy, please know that I love this trilogy so much. I don't want anyone to misinterpret that as me saying I dislike this movie. I love all 3 movies, and who knows, maybe next time I rewatch them, Before Midnight will end up being my favorite. I believe Ethan Hawke described the films by saying Before Sunrise is about what could be, Before Sunset is about what should have been, and Before Midnight is about what it is. And back when I was in my never going to date anyone or develop feelings for anyone phase, I was very picky about romance films. I hated how unrealistic so many of them are. If the characters got their happily ever after, I would sit there and think, okay, well the movie is over, but am I supposed to just believe that they stay happy for the rest of their lives? One of them is eventually going to outlive the other. It isn't going to be all sunshine and rainbows from here on out. And that's why I appreciate Before Midnight so much. It's like getting to see what happens after that happily ever after moment. I think movies like this are essential because they show that no relationship is perfect. No one is perfect. We're all flawed and just trying to figure things out. And if 2 people are willing to try and put in the effort and communicate and make it work, then that's what matters. A lot of people idealize relationships and think they have to be perfect, so they panic at the first sign of conflict, but conflict is inevitable. I mean, it's also important to know when a situation is toxic or dangerous, but conflict is normal even in the healthiest relationships. As Celine says in the first film, why does everyone think conflict is so bad? There are a lot of good things coming out of conflict. I think Before Midnight shows how important it is to accept that things aren't going to be perfect and people aren't going to live up to our fantasies. I don't think there's one main life lesson I've learned from these films because every time I rewatch them, I learn something new about myself. So I guess the main takeaway is that we're just constantly evolving and rediscovering ourselves, and that it's okay to want to be loved and you shouldn't stifle the romantic parts of yourself, but it's also imperative not to idealize relationships or put them on a pedestal because they will always be imperfect.